So the Marquee UI then, let's take a look. So first we see this, it's the usual gray kind of VFX UI you would expect, I guess. So we have this projects tab, and this is where all our projects we work on will end up. You have some, you can have the thumbnails, can filter by some different like name, model name and stuff like that, or recent. And this is disk usage. So Marquee needs a temp directory, and it's usually a fast SSD drive or something on your computer. So it can't be on the network. It has to be a really fast drive to bake to. And down here we have some buttons. We have the new. This is where you create a new project. The delete, if you want to delete a project. So you can open a project, an archive, so you can archive, and you can also copy a archive or a project. So you have, you see there's a lot of UI things here by the side, but you can't access them when you don't have a project opened. So this, let's open this one, for example. So I double click on it. So I will go through how to create a new project in other videos. So let's open this archive. And it loads the object and populates the channels, whatever that was. So let's just take away this. So let's take a look here now what we have. So in the UI, for example, we can start up here. We have the usual file, save, edit. There you have preferences. You can manage shortcuts. Similar selection. So that's most of this is reflecting in like toolbars and in other places essentially. So for example, channels, most of this stuff you can actually access in the panels over here. So let's make sure now if this is a stock UI. So if we take the view and use the default layout, so this is what the default layout in Marquee should look like. So I kind of scrap this immediately and redo it myself. So let's take a look. I mean, you can take stuff and move around. For example, if I take this row, I can move it maybe up there. I can actually move it to a sidebar. Oops. It's a little tricky sometimes to get it to stick. You can take, if I take this image manager, for example, I can dock it to the other side. So this is called tabs. And you have a list of tabs that you can access. If you go to an empty space out here and right click, you have a number of tabs you can access, and also some features. For example, if I disable the color space that was down there will disappear. So it's stuff like this. You can, yeah, depends on how you wanna have it. Usually I don't really mess with those kind of things. It's more rebuilding the tabs that is kind of important to me. So we could let's disable all tabs. Just hide them and can look through it. So okay, so we have this icons here as well. It's shortcuts or icons for open, saving, undo, redo. And this field here is related to the active tool you have. So this is the toolbar. You have the selection, a marquee selection tool if you want to make, actually, let's make a new channel just to have something that's not transparent. Okay, disable the wireframe as well. And let's look at it shaded. Okay, so marquee selection, you can make different selections. So this will kind of you can only paint inside a selection. So you can yeah, when you have this tool, this field here reflects all the things you can do with that tool. Likewise, if you hit this, the move transform paint buffer, it will shift to become all the paint buffer related stuff you can do. A zoom, that's a zoom paint buffer. So the paint buffer is Mari's way of applying paint. You don't paint directly on object. It's like painting on a sheet of glass in front of it, and then you project it down. So that's both a benefit and a real pain. Sometimes it depends on how you use the painting. Moving, and you can move the object to rotate it. I don't do that often. Vector, I don't use it as. Blurring, so if you have something, you can actually blur the paint afterwards. So if you painted something, you can blur the paint, but you have to bake the blur. So it's kind of extracts what I have from the paint from your paint, and then you have to bake it. What else? Yeah, that's a transform. If you have something or you haven't baked it, you can transform. You can rectangle and start to push and pull. We're gonna go through that later as well. Similar here, you can move paint around more like in a soft fashion. Here is a Pinup Tool. It's similar. You can transform, you can make a lot of dots, and they will kind of act as some kind of magnets. So it's more like, yeah, it's like it saves the actual deformation after the next point. So it depends on how many points you apply. So the paintbrush tool, that's what you would think about painting. You can have different pencils on stuff. Let's see, take something else. Yeah, that's where you actually apply your paint. And you see up here, it also shifts. This row shifts that I said with all the different tools. So that's kind of the tool. Toe brush. Oh no, that's a vector paint. That's an eraser, and eraser doesn't really erase paint in that sense you would think. So if I paint something and I haven't baked it, you can use the E button, that becomes an eraser, or this, hit that button. So it only erases the paint before it's baked. So if you want to actually remove something, I will show you how to do that later in the painting section. So vector painting, I will not cover that now. Paint through, so that's something that's very common. So if I hit the L, I get the image, like a pop-up image manager. So I can drag this image into the view and it becomes a paint through. And then you can use this as a stencil to bake. Very common. Gradient. You can set different colors. It's it's not the best gradient. I would like to have more options, to have more like a Photoshop multicolor way of applying this. But you can set some options. You have a let's see, I don't use this that often actually, but you have some settings to tone the way it applies the gradient. Clone. So you can clone from one area to the other, and this makes it extracts whatever into the current paint buffer, so you have to bake it to apply it. Toe brush, you can select an area, then you can move it around. Similar here, you have to, yeah, it's a little strange concept. It's more like a healing brush thing. You can move around things, maybe like blemishes and stuff. Oops, sorry. That's a color picker, and it's C, shortcut C. And here you have like color, select color, and you have the shortcuts. If you hit D, it makes it black and white, similar to Photoshop, and X, similar to Photoshop, foreground, background. So that's cover, really short, briefly, those. So this one is then covered. It's the tool kind of shortcuts or settings for each of those. P-text, we don't want to touch it now. So, and this button, if I paint something here, if I take a color, red for example, whoops, this is, oh, this is, my bad. This is still p-text. I was looking for actually this one. This is remove paint from paint buffer. But I never use that button. I have there's a shortcut for it, that's Control-Shift-C. It removes whatever is in the paint buffer. But if you're unfamiliar with the shortcuts, you can hit this button there. Okay, so this panel here that I moved is it's kind of like in this one you look at the selected channel. So this is a channel, this is current layer and below. So this is more like a way of analyzing either channels or dissecting your layer approach. I will show that when we come into the layering. And yeah, so what else? Over here we have a shortcut for wireframe, and these ones over here, that's more if we go into the UV view, so we have this perspective, orthographic. If I hit this, it goes to orthographic. Ortho UV, that's a mix between orthographic and UV. So here's the UV view. So if I paint somewhere here, it's gonna end up in the UV view, and I can likewise paint here and it's gonna end up there. But this is the UV view, and those buttons is UV view related. So this one enables the masking for the actual UV mask. This one is similar. What's whole patch project, and this one is UV image rendering. I don't use it that often, but sometimes you might end up in the like this mode when it looks like this and you wonder what's going on. Could be good to know that these are the buttons to check out. And likewise, if you're in orthographic, you might end up maybe with two perspective cameras by an accident, and you want to have a orthographic camera back, so you can just hit one of those tabs and hit this button. It will shift it to orthographic camera, or you could essentially also make it a UV view, but orthographic is probably the most common camera you want to use. Perspective is more like if you inspect shading and stuff, because if you make it really fisheye, it can be problematic to paint, especially if it's super fisheye. You don't want to paint in something like this. Let's get it back. Okay, so what else do we have? So this is selection mode. So if I hit this select item button and have this mode enabled, it's gonna select the whole object. I can't do anything else with it except the whole object. If I hit this button, I'm in patch mode, and then I can select the patches, and the patch is essentially one of those. So this is one patch, this is one patch, and one patch is a UDIM from 0 to 1 and everything that's in it. And then you have the option here. This is face selection, and then you select the faces, and you have options here, front and through. Gonna go more into this later on as well. Could be good to know something about if you're not familiar with what UDIMs is. So that's something that's was invented to have an organized way of painting a asset without painting one texture at a time, so you can treat it as a whole channel kind of concept. So what it does, it numbers your UV patches. So this is what probably most people is used to mapping, like from 0 to 1. But if you put them next to each other, this becomes 1001, and this one next to it becomes 1002. So you map it up to this 1010, and then in chains row. If you would put something out here, in Mori at least, you wouldn't be able to texture this patch. and you wouldn't be able to texture below either or on this side. So it has to be from there to there, 10 wide, but you can go virtually, I'm not sure what limit it would be, but I worked on assets with 2000 UDIMs going, I guess, continuing in a lot of rows. What else? Yeah, this is shading modes. So you have the flat shaded, let's take the lights. If you would turn on lights. So yeah, this is flat shaded with specular shadows. The environment light can't produce shadows, so we can take this light, can enable or disable shadows. So if you would have another light just to give a fill, you can get something that's a little more interesting, and then you can maybe blend in a environment light. So yeah, that's a way to get some kind of preview. Clear paint buffer, and here you have symmetrical painting, and it's just symmetrical in the sense of the paint buffer. So if I would paint, this dividing line will be the center of the symmetrical. Likewise, it's gonna be symmetrical in that direction or in this direction, like a 4-way. If you want to do some funky maneuvers. And hovering about, it's like Alt, and it's the standard kind of manipulation of movement as in most programs, like Alt and then middle mouse and stuff like that. In orthographic view, we wanna tumble like in the different planes. You have the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Good to know. Yeah, so let's look at some ways. So we have all the patches wherever shading, painting, all of this is kind of related to whatever we have here. And let's look at one of the time of the panels. Brush editor, you can dock it here, for example, if you wanna start to edit stuff. So here you have the properties for making one of the pencils or brushes. So you can make your own, play with settings. Spacing will probably have an impact. Yeah, we'll go more into detail later on that. And channels, that's an important one. This is where you create your channels, and you will probably export those as well as textures in the end. Those are closely related to layers, I guess. So a layer, we'll go more into the layering, but this is similar to Photoshop. You can layer stuff on top of each other. Blending modes, similar. Color manager, that's something that you will probably not mess with that often. It has to do with color setup if you load LUTs or stuff like that. And this will probably be set up for someone in, like, if you're in a facility, it will be standardized and you will not really touch it, or you will probably not be even allowed to touch it. Colors, let's pop it there. This is where you can select colors You can actually load an image, or if you would have like some image that you want to sample from, can drag it into there. Maybe like a HDR. Can I paint with HDR values? That's also possible. Gray swatches. History view. Everything you do will build like a history, so you can go back. Layers, image manager. Yeah, this is where you load images. We will go through that as well, and also like settings for loading stuff. Layers, we look at that. Lights, this is where you manipulate your lights. Modal render, so you have a way of previewing channels and textures in a like an offline render way. This is really slow, but you can do it. You can also use it to bake a lot of stuff. So you can render ambient occlusion and some basic stuff. And if you install the extension pack plugins that Jens Kaffitz wrote, you will have additional ones here. We'll show that as well later. Node graph. So you have a way to manipulate stuff in a node-based way. We'll look at that as well. And closely related to that is the node properties. So when you have let's close everything of this. Node properties. So if you have a node graph, you want to edit a node, double click on it and it comes up here. So this is similar to Nuke, that you have a properties palette for your nodes. Objects, if you have different objects in the scene, or if you want to swap objects or add new versions of stuff, this is the place, and we show that as well later. Painting, this is paint buffer related. We'll go through this. This is where you switch bit depth and resolution of paint buffers and similar. Let's see, paint buffer, painting, patches. This is in the UV view. I talked about patches here, and this is, you can access them here. I don't really use this. I kind of manipulate stuff in another sense, but you can access them there. Pixel analyzer, it's for sampling pixels in your scene, and you can accumulate. Now I just have a gray, but yeah, you can sample values and stuff in that one. What else? Player controls. So Mari has the option to import like animated alembic caches and similar. So you could essentially have a deformable object, and maybe in a certain angle when you get texture stretching, when an elbow crease or something, you might need to tweak something, or like a car crashing into something, you want to make a scratch pattern where like it's intersecting. You could import a animated object and use that for texturing as well. It's not that common, but yeah, I've done it a few times. Can be handy. Player projection. This is has to do with masks, and we will look into this. So you have a different way of masking objects or using edge masks, channel masks, ambient occlusion, similar. And Python, if you're a Python guy or a girl, this is the place where you can manipulate Python. Selection groups, you can make selection sets. For example, this is everything, and then you can make a face selection. So you can come back to the same selection. And maybe you wanna like hide that or hide everything but that. And that's something you can do. Let's close this. Shaders, we'll come back to that, but you can have a few, can load a bunch of shaders here and preview stuff. You're painting in a more like a look dev friendly way. And shelf, that's, you can have your brushes and stuff. And snapshots, I don't use it that often, but you can kind of save like a state, continue to work, and then you can say, okay, I want to go back to this state now. And if you want to explore something, I don't really use that. I used it when it was out, like when it was new, but I think it's a little, I don't really work that way. I kind of work in a non-destructive way in the node graph nowadays, so I haven't really had that much use for it. Maybe it's really good, but I don't know. Tool properties. So if you have, for example, a paint through tool, you have different settings for different tools. So here you can manipulate different aspects of the, let's see, texture. So preview, maybe you want to bring down the alpha to see the underlying model better and similar. So it's more like a tool tip, tool properties place. Yeah, that's kind of, and the rest is all of those, that's the UI, actual UI for the actual Marquee. And down here you have ways to enable or disable like rotation, zooming in and out. Maybe you just want to orbit around Y, but you don't want to go up and down. So you can disable or enable that. Color space is for the way it handles your kind of your what should I say, like your linear workflow and stuff like that. So you have a color management, you have LUTs. At most facilities you will probably have a show LUT and look dev LUT and anything that you're supposed to look through. You can look through different like channels, RGB. You can also do like in nuke and gain and exposure, gamma, to preview different light conditions. And yeah, that's kind of the basics for the UI, and you can reset it under the view, load default. And I usually make something, save it like a setup that I like, and save it as a new default by saying save layout, and goes to your Marquee folder, new layout. So the next time you start Marquee, this will be the default layout. And I also usually just go and assign shortcuts to panels that I use a lot. For example, I have a few ones here. Control 4, 3, 5. So control 4 is shaders, control 3 is channels, control 5 is layers. So then if I would hide everything here, oops, and you want to access, for example, node properties, if you want to access the channels, control 3, control 4 shaders, and control 5 layers. So I would probably map all my usual panels I use often, and then I can quickly access them by pressing the hotkeys. So you can map a lot of things in here, shortcuts. You can also look up if you're unsure what's mapped. If you hit F1, for example, it's gonna tell you it's mapped put to flat shading, so it's that button as well. So yeah, that's kind of a basic rundown, and we're gonna jump in later on a little more in depth in each of these and look at them more like on a workflow basis. So yeah, thanks for this. Bye.